Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar, The Future of Low Carbon Power from Intermittent to Indispensable. My name is Chris Robinson, and I'm a Senior Director here at Lux Research. I'll be moderating today's session. Presenting today is my colleague, Anuru Bupalam, analyst here at Lux Research. Throughout the webinar, you can type any questions you have in the questions box on your screen. Time permitting, we'll answer all the questions that we can, and if your question does not get answered, please don't hesitate to email it to questions@luxresearchinc.com, and we'll make sure to respond. If at any point you experience technical difficulties, such as a frozen screen, try refreshing your browser and just check your internet connection is strong. And with that, we can jump into the presentation. So over to you, Anurag.
Thank you, Chris. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'd like to start off by drawing attention to a major recent event that I'm sure many of you saw on the news and some of you might have even experienced firsthand. I'm talking about the Iberian Peninsula blackout. So on the 20th of April, 2025, a massive and sudden blackout disrupted electricity supply across most of Spain, parts of Portugal, and some ripple effects even reaching the south of France. The outage began at around 12:30 in the afternoon and led to the loss of approximately 15 gigawatts of power in Spain. That's about 60% of the country's demand at the time. Power was restored progressively, but full service took about 24 hours in some regions. And the blackout led to severe disruptions in transportation, communications, emergency services, and was also associated with at least 8 reported fatalities. There have been many theories that have been going around why it happened, including cyber attacks, etc., and some of them have been ruled out. One reason that has been mentioned more often is the rise of renewables, as Spain is looking to move to a net zero grid. If we look at data on the evolution of the share of electricity generation in Spain, this becomes clearly visible. Since 2000, coal has gone down from over 35% to 1% in 2024. The use of gas has been going down in the past couple of years to under 20%. And in this period, the clear rises have been from solar and wind. Both have gone from under 3% in 2000 to 17 and 22% respectively in 2024. So today they make up 2 of the top generation sources in Spain. And this is not something we're seeing only in Spain, but also worldwide. So the share of renewables in net new added generation has only been increasing in the last 20 years. In 2024, renewables and nuclear were responsible for more than 80% of all new generation, and solar and wind alone were represented for 55%. The world is therefore looking to move towards a net zero grid. But renewables alone are not enough for this net zero grid. We need a variety of generation to improve reliability, especially when we look at the amounts of solar and wind being added. They are intermittent and need support. We also need long duration energy storage. Solar and wind, for instance, could produce significant surpluses at certain times, and this energy could be stored and used later. And finally, we need demand flexibility, or sources of flexible demand that can be turned off to reduce peak load during times of congestion. For instance, using distributed energy resource management systems, etc. Therefore, there is a need to improve reliability alongside meeting new power demand and decarbonization. And these topics feature heavily in our utility innovation priorities. And they also feature heavily in the innovation activities of top 80 energy companies globally, with over 90% having some involvement in innovation in each of these topics. In today's webinar, we'll first discuss various renewables and their characteristics with some use cases. Then we'll present some numbers around economics and reliability before ending with an outlook. So amongst renewable, there are several that can provide continuous or dispatchable power, for example, geothermal and nuclear, which have seen huge surge in interest recently, aided by hyperscalers looking to power their data centers. Meta, for instance, announced with Sage Geosystems about building 150 megawatt of geothermal power in the US, with the first phase expected to be operational by 2027. Several have signed power purchase agreements around nuclear power, the likes of Amazon, Microsoft, Google, etc. An example is Google's partnership with Kairos Power for 500 megawatts of power from small modular reactors by 2035, with the first reactor slated to go online by 2030. Both geothermal and nuclear are typically characterized by delays, so it does remain to be seen whether these go online as expected. Apart from these continuous sources of power, data center developers or the hyperscalers are also looking at solar and wind, which are intermittent. Meta, for example, is signing a 200 megawatt PPA with RWE in Texas. Google signed a 79.3 megawatt PPA for onshore wind power in Virginia. And notably, this is the state's first onshore wind farm. There are several more examples of such PPAs being signed, and as we saw earlier, solar and wind are increasing rapidly. Now, this increase of solar and wind brings challenges, as noted by California's famous duck curve. This is quite an old curve from 2020, but does illustrate these challenges quite well. So the curve shows how solar power generation causes a steep drop in net electricity demand during midday, followed by a sharp spike in the evening as solar output declines, but electricity use remains high, and that has to be met by other sources. Solar cannot give you that high level of reliability. But there are now attempts to achieve high levels of reliability using solar and wind through these so-called around-the-clock power projects. One example is Masdar, which announced a 1 gigawatt baseload project in the UAE with 5.2 gigawatts of solar and 19.2 gigawatt hour of storage. Another example is Renew Power, which is building a 400 megawatt baseload project in India with 400 megawatts of solar, 900 megawatts of wind, and 100 megawatts of storage. So this raises questions around economics. Solar and wind are typically known to provide cheap electrons, but does that still hold when we need to oversize them by so much to achieve high reliability? And then do they compete with costs? Do they compete on costs with geothermal, nuclear, etc., which are known to have high capex value, but can also provide high reliability? These are the questions that we're going to answer in the second part of this webinar by presenting some results around economics and reliability of the different power generation sources. So in our analysis, we consider several power generation sources, solar and wind, both with storage, so 4-hour lithium-ion systems. And we also consider nuclear, geothermal, and hydrogen fuel cells. We use natural gas in combined cycle gas turbines, CCGTs, as a benchmark value. And we compute the levelized cost of electricity for each of them. We do this in 2 steps. So first, there's the adequacy analysis, where we use NREL's open source probabilistic resource adequacy suite tool to assess resource adequacy. So we use load data and power generation data to determine if there's any shortfall or surplus, and if so, how much. And then we use this along with cost data to calculate LCOEs, levelized cost of electricity, in US dollars per megawatt hour. We do this analysis for 2 regions, that's Norway and Saudi Arabia, because they're representative of vastly varying climates. So let's first look at some results for the continuous power sources. We consider loads from 10 megawatts to 10 gigawatts. We assume country-specific gas prices, country-specific electricity prices to produce hydrogen, and use data from surrounding regions for nuclear and geothermal. I will note that geothermal is not really present in both these regions, especially for generating electricity, but will present some estimates for the sake of comparison. So first, you will note that there is quite some variability in geothermal and nuclear, and this is because of the scaling effect. Larger loads have lower LCOEs as a result. At the lower end of these ranges, geothermal and nuclear can become cost competitive with CCGT in Norway, but not in Saudi Arabia, where gas is really cheap. The LCOE for hydrogen fuel cells is high primarily because of fuel costs. Green hydrogen is really expensive, and it is uncertain how and when it might decrease. Now, solar and wind are intermittent, and we need to assess their reliability first before determining the levelized cost of electricity. So we assess reliability as the percentage of load served. And we assess reliability by generating heat maps of the reliability with changing capacity. So we increase solar and storage capacity by up to 25 times the load and see how that affects reliability. As an example, for a 1 gigawatt load, a 5x solar increase would be a 5 gigawatt solar system, and a 5x storage increase would be 5 gigawatt hour of storage. And as a reminder, we use 4-hour lithium-ion systems. So these are the heat maps with the corresponding reliability values. So first, we can see that oversizing does not guarantee high reliability. In Norway, for instance, even when we have a 25x solar and storage system, we do not even reach 80% reliability. In a sun-rich country like Saudi Arabia, we can reach 95% at this level. Second, the addition of storage does help increase reliability. As we go from 1x to 2x storage, reliability almost doubles. But as expected, we see diminishing returns because there are just not enough electrons. Now, what does this mean for costs? So we plot the minimum LCOE to reach a certain level of reliability, and we can see the curves rise up as expected. So in Norway, going from 40% reliability to 75% reliability more than doubles the LCOE. At 75%, reliability would cost close to $800 US per megawatt hour. In Saudi Arabia, the curve is not that steep. Going from 40% to 95% increases the LCOE by a factor of about 2. And here that number is about $358 US per megawatt hour. So solar is not very cheap anymore at these high levels of reliability. Now moving on to wind, we can do the same exercise with wind, with the heat maps. Here we go up only to 15x since we require much less oversizing. So in Norway, for instance, we can see that we achieve a reliability of 90% at 8-9x the capacity. Even in sun-rich countries, reliability from wind is higher than reliability from solar. At around 10 to 12x, we begin to see 90% reliabilities. So looking at LCOEs, this means that wind premiums are not that high, but there is a steep increase above 70%. In Norway, going from 70% to 90% increases the LCOE by a factor of 2.5 to $250 US per megawatt hour. The corresponding increase in Saudi Arabia is even higher. Going from 70% to 95% increases the LCOE by a factor of 3.5 to $350 a megawatt hour. So I forgot to mention, this was onshore wind. Now let's look at offshore wind. And offshore wind really shines in Norway as there are high capacity factors. We begin to see 90% reliability at 1x wind capacity and 2x storage capacity. And at around 9 to 10 times the capacity, we start seeing 99% reliability. Saudi Arabia, offshore wind, is not as promising, with 90% reached only at 15x oversizing. And this is reflected in the LCOEs as well. They shoot up in Saudi Arabia when the required reliability is more than 55%. The LCOE of $653 at 85% is almost 3 times the LCOE at 55%. The LCOE increase in Norway is less pronounced. So to get from 60 to 85%, there's about a 40% increase in LCOE. But to reach 95%, there's a further doubling of the LCOE to approximately $220 a megawatt hour. So with all these results, let's compare everything in one graph per region. So bringing back the continuous power source LCOEs from earlier. So first, we add CCGT plus CCS, so carbon capture and storage, using values from the IEA. And we see that even with CCS, CCGTs remain cost competitive. And then we bring in the solar at 50, 70, and 90% reliability. So we cannot achieve 90% reliability with solar in Norway, which is why that corresponding bar is empty. And here we can see that solar is really expensive and is closer to the higher end of the ranges of geothermal and nuclear. Wind performs quite well in Norway. Even at high reliability levels, it can be cheaper than large geothermal and nuclear projects where there is the scaling benefit. In Saudi Arabia, cheap gas wins. Even with CCS costs added, it is among the lower LCOE. The abundance of sun means solar can generate a lot, but at higher levels of reliability, it becomes relatively expensive. The same applies for wind, although the wind industry in Saudi Arabia is still in its early stages. So these results bring us to a key takeaway. In chasing reliability, intermittent renewables may lose their cost edge. As mentioned earlier, intermittent renewables like solar and wind are typically associated with cheap electrons. But as we oversize systems and add complementary storage, costs rise up. Sources like geothermal and nuclear are much more expensive on a capex basis than solar and wind. But if we begin to look at them on an LCOE basis, at high levels of reliability, the cost gap significantly narrows or even disappears for larger loads, given the scaling effect of these sources. With that, we move to the last part of the webinar with an outlook. So first, solar and wind need external stability. We did see that farming solar and wind, that is with support of additional capacity or storage, raises LCOE to premium levels. Furthermore, it also comes with practical constraints with regards to availability of land. Therefore, they're best used as low-cost complements since they provide cheap electrons at lower reliability levels. In addition, solar and wind also require investments in grid inertia and demand management. Technologies like flywheels, grid-forming inverters, and synchronous condensers help increase inertia. Market-based mechanisms like VPPs or flexibility markets help with demand management. Next, we saw that batteries boost reliability, but also add costs. In our analysis, we considered 4-hour systems, but we're also seeing 8-hour systems emerge in Australia and Canada capacity auctions. These are essentially 2 4-hour systems hooked together. This currently makes sense as, broadly speaking, lithium-ion is still the cheapest 8-hour system globally. And here at Lux, we're doing a lot more work around storage economics. Our research shows that newer technologies like flow batteries are more suited for 10 to 12-hour needs. Next, we also saw that the addition of CCS costs still retain a cost advantage for natural gas with CCGTs. So with regards to CCS, there are several technologies here. While incumbent amine solvents technology has been validated and deployed, it has some weaknesses. Amines have a high energy consumption, are corrosive, and can degrade in the presence of oxygen, resulting in solvent loss. So while it is a ready solution, it may not be optimal. So we're seeing other technologies emerge. So there's other technologies like new solvent, sorbent, and membrane compositions that are addressing these issues and use less corrosive materials, as well as cryogenic and electro-swing systems that change the mechanics of CO2 capture process. Here I'd also like to highlight solvents and next-gen sorbents, as a diverse set of innovators have developed technology that improves key performance metrics like energy consumption compared to incumbent solvents. Finally, dispatchables are important in the long haul. We saw that they become cost competitive on an LCOE basis for large projects with higher reliability requirements. They've recently been gaining a lot of traction with the data center boom. All hyperscalers like Google, Meta, Amazon, Microsoft have announced deals around geothermal and nuclear power. There are likely to be delays, but long-term potential is strong. Also because these dispatchables will be very useful in ELCC-based capacity markets, which are in the works in multiple regions. So with that, thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Yeah, thank you, Anirudh. And as noted, we'll be taking some questions you might have in the presentation. As a reminder, you can drop those into the questions box. And if we don't get to your question in this call, we'll be in touch after the webinar. So we had one come in so far that was kind of about the flexibility side of this. What resources do we think can enable greater levels of demand flexibility in the future?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one big resource that can add demand flexibility is using electric vehicles or charging, so smart charging, but bidirectional charging. And I'd also like to call out battery swapping here. We've seen quite a bit of interest recently, especially with CATL making major announcements. So that's something definitely to keep an eye on, especially in Asia.
And then getting back to power generation, I know we looked primarily at Norway and Saudi Arabia for this analysis, but the question is more broadly around the world, where do we expect to see resources like novel nuclear or novel geothermal projects first deployed?
Yeah, so I think these geothermal and nuclear make a lot of sense in northern climates, essentially because solar is pretty much absent in the winter. It doesn't really generate much, as we saw with the Norwegian heat maps. So somewhere like Japan, for instance, for nuclear, there's a lot of regulatory support. It's a northern climate, so nuclear makes a lot of sense there. Also, I'd like to call out, for instance, the US. There were some regulatory changes around nuclear with executive orders recently to speed up permitting. So the US is also definitely a country to keep an eye on.
And then I think the final question we probably have time for, we looked at a 4-hour system for storage. How would this change if we looked at some of the 8-hour lithium-ion systems or other types of long-duration storage technologies that can offer more than 8 hours of storage potentially?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it wouldn't change the results too much. And this is primarily because even though you can store energy for 8 hours, the amount of power you can dispose at any instant would be half. So it's not like they would enable you to disperse more power. So you would need bigger systems, and they're also more expensive. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep, excellent. So that, thank you, Anirudh. That concludes our webinar for today. The slide presentation and the recording from the webinar will be sent out to all attendees via email. After leaving, you will be prompted to complete a survey in today's presentation. We do appreciate any feedback you might have. It helps inform and improve future webinars. So take a moment to view our upcoming webinars. Thank you for joining us, and have a great day.